Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. We are reading the book Patricia St. John Tells Her Own Story by Patricia St. John with permission of 10 of Those Publishing Company. And we are on Chapter 2, Early Years at Malvern. Holmesdale in Malvern was a solid 3-storied brick building and it housed 4 generations. Great Granny was bedridden but continued to exert quite an influence in the family. She was a real stickler for propriety, and some of my earliest memories are turning somersaults on the lowest bough of an apple tree. Age about 5, and of hearing a sharp tat-tat on the bedroom window above. Great Granny's voice rang out loud and clear. "Patricia, I can see your knickers." Granny, recently widowed at that time, was one of the great loves of my life. She was an amazing hard worker, and everyone who came in contact with her became, for a time, the same. The second coming of the Lord was an ever-present reality to her, and she lived in a constant state of readiness for departure. No letter was ever left unanswered overnight, and she would sometimes exasperate us by keeping us all waiting to start on some expedition while she retidied her drawers. "He may come while we are out," she would say sweetly, "and I wouldn't like those left behind to think Christians have untidy drawers." The arrival of my mother, the most hospitable, outgoing person imaginable, plus 2 small children and a new baby, must have upset their quiet world considerably. But Granny rose to the challenge, and Great Granny loved us from her bed, and I believed we were, like most little ones, a lovable crowd. Hazel, dark and curly, was a born leader. She would sit Farnham and me down in front of her and tell us hair-raising stories. My mother once happened to overhear the dramatic ending of one of them and recounted with bated breath. "She took her to the Hopsy, nothin' could be done. They took her to the nursing home, nothin' could be done. They took her to the convalescent, nothin' could be done." She also sang songs to us, and fascinated by the local music teacher, Miss Mary Flint, she would sit at the piano, legs dangling, and touch the keys gently. "I'm Miss Mary Flint," she would announce grandly, and start off accompanying her own impromptu compositions. Farnham was gentle and very loving. He would stare into space through soft brown eyes and utter deep thoughts. "Could you put a net over me, Mummy?" he said, mumbled dreamily as she was tucking him up one night. "Why?" she asked. "Because then I couldn't get any bigger. I should always stay little, and then I should never have to go away from you." He also loved numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, he would whisper in his cot. "And then there's that naught. Isn't naught a beautiful and useful number?" He loved to play surprises, and my mother remembered him rushing excitingly into the house after seeing a hearse. "Mummy, Mummy," he shouted, "could we get a black cab and fill it with flowers like the one in the road and go all the way to the station in it and meet Granny when she comes home?" I was fat and curly and seemed to have a retentive memory, absorbing phrases and reproducing them in surprising contexts. When I was about 2, my mother found me holding the rail of my cot and bouncing up and down. When asked what I thought I was doing, I replied cheerfully, "I's always abounding in the work of the Lord." My cot stood in Granny's bedroom, and early in the morning I would creep into Granny's big double bed and share her early cup of tea. She would improve the happy hour by teaching me hymns from an ancient black book, and I, fascinated by the strange, picturesque vocabulary, would lap them up. There was one I especially liked about the archangel summoning the ransomed host. When some visitor innocently asked where Granny would be on some future date, I looked up and remarked brightly, "She may be with the handsome host." Oliver, 2.5 years younger than me, was a strong-minded, inventive member of the family and had a strange power of involving everyone in the vicinity in his projects. He was Great Granny's favorite, and she loved to have him sit beside her on the bed. One day my mother left him with her looking at a picture book, but Oliver's interest at that time was focused on trains, and he had other plans. My mother came back to find 3 bedroom chairs arranged one in front of the other, with Oliver sitting on the front and Great Granny in her nightgown astride the second. Both were jiggling earnestly up and down and saying, "Puff, puff, puff, puff." He was always carried in, warm and pink from his bath, to say good night, and he would get in beside her while she drank her nightly cup of hot milk laced with a teaspoon of whiskey. Oliver missed nothing. One day my mother was invited to tea with a neighbor and a little old lady who was an ardent teetotaler. The tiny sandwiches and fairy cakes were brought in by a maid, and tea was poured by the silver teapot. She turned to Oliver, age 2, sitting solidly on her mother's knee. "And what would you like, my little dear? A glass of milk?" There was something familiar about the white hair and the lace cap and the gentle voice. It brought back pleasant memories. Oliver jiggled up and down. "Whiskey, whiskey, whiskey," he shouted. I was 5 when John was born, and in keeping with the usual custom of those days, we were told nothing. Granny never allowed anything to be mentioned before it was born, and we never seemed to notice my mother's size. Farnham and I thought babies were left by God in the cistern at the top of the house, and we sometimes went out to look. On this occasion I was sent to stay with Great Auntie Emmy, and I was told only there was a toy and it was alive. I anticipated a puppy or a kitten and ran all the way home from the railroad station. I burst through the door shouting, "Where's the kitten?" "It's not a kitten," someone said. "It's a baby brother." He was lying upstairs in a basket cradle trimmed with lace. I touched the top of his head and sat down on the stairs and wept for joy. He was my baby, and wherever he had come from, I adored him. But my mother had no intentions of letting us grow up as ignorant on the facts of life as she had been. We acquired a cat who, to my extreme delight, had kittens in my armpit one night as I lay asleep, and from the mess they made there was no doubt at all where they had come from. She had brought us a couple of rabbits who had frequent babies, and I remember my grandmother's horror and outrage when I burst into the room where she was entertaining visitors and announced excitedly, "Come quick and look, the rabbits are mating." And in this rather complicated household, my mother brought us up to love God and to love all things beautiful and to laugh. The population of Malvern was an elderly one, and as far as I remember, we were the only children in Alexander Road. But my mother survived, and as we grew, the older neighbors came to love her and to tolerate us. There was a kind of Cold War with the Miss Wheelers next door, where the rabbits, in spite of all their efforts, would sometimes nip through the railings into their garden. On the other side were the Miss Hearthcote, and Farnham and I loved to creep up under their kitchen window in the dark and frighten their cook with her brilliant, lifelike impersonations of tomcats fighting. Once, to our rapture, she threw water over us, but our peals of laughter gave us away. Elsie, our dear Elsie, reigned supreme in the kitchen. She lived in the cottages at the back and came to us as a teenager. I think it must have been Granny who trained her to such a degree of perfection, my mother being more happy-go-lucky about domestic matters. She was a beautiful girl, artistic, creative, and very clever. She came into her own during the Second World War when she rose to a highly responsible position in the WVS. But for the love of my mother, she stayed with us for many years. To us, she was a wonderful person, and we still visit her, bedridden in a nursing home, and she still loves to reminisce about the old days of our childhood. She remembers how Hazel, passing the kitchen on her way home from school, would always call out, "Are you there, Elsie?" And on being reassured, we would go on upstairs. On being questioned why she did this, she replied, "Because I'm so afraid that one day you might not be." But Elsie was always there, and one of our greatest treats was to be invited to tea in the kitchen, when Elsie taught us songs that our parents would not have taught us. His mother was an earwig, and his father was a whale, and I'm going to put a bit of salt upon his tail. We would trill happily while embedding slice after slice of hot buttered toast. Sundays were unforgettable. In an age when many children brought up in Christian homes were put off religion forever by the gloomy, boring Sundays, my mother made them exciting, colorful days. And she needed to, because the Little Brethren church where we worshipped was a bleak building, furnished with rows of wooden benches and dark, chocolate-colored walls. It was devoid of flowers or instrumental music, and the services from a small child's point of view were long and wearisome. We were led in week by week, wiggling in the unaccustomed stiffness of Sunday clothes and all sharply on the lookout for anything that might prove the least bit amusing. But the old bench creaked under our silent mirth when a stray cat wandered down the aisle and the old man with a shaky hand tried to catch it, or when the cock began to crow, was accidentally rendered as the crow began to croak, or when the 5-year-old Oliver shook with ill-congealed giggles over reading in Colossians. I never knew there was a book in the Bible called Galatians. he whispered. Otherwise, we settled down to entertain ourselves with Daniel's Beast or the last chapter of Job, which dealt with the homely subject of bird eggs, or the less suitable stories of Judges, and we probably learned more than we thought we did. From a very early age, I conceived a love of those old stately brethren hymns, packed with such a wealth of poetry and doctrine and adoration, that has lasted for the rest of my life. We were the only children in the congregation, apart from 4 picturesque little sisters who appeared in the holidays in straw hats and ringlets and sat through the services like statues. We considered such virtue an insult to childhood. On Sundays we despised them and called them stay-puts, but on weekdays without their hats they turned out to be good sports, and we welcomed their company. One grew up and many years later to become one of my closest friends, and her beautiful Cotswold home is a refuge where I often retreat. The result of belonging to this childless congregation was that we were cherished and spoiled, especially at Christmas, far beyond our deserts. The members loved my mother too, although she caused them some anxiety at times. They were never quite sure what she might do next, as on the day of my brother's baptism when she pranced into the somber church like a breath of spring, her arms full of almond blossoms, and insisted on decorating the baptistry. Some shook their heads at this display of worldliness, but most secretly smiled. As we grew older, we soon learned to love these grave, kind old men and women, and because we had comparatively few friends outside the circle of our church, their deep piety and single-minded devotion to God became our unconsciously accepted standard of adult Christianity, and for this I have often thanked God. But the service being over, we belted for home in high spirits, for the rest of Sunday was the most exciting day of the week. There was a special pudding and sweets after lunch, and for the little ones, tiny biscuits shaped like letters. Being Sunday, you had to make a text with them, and special bricks and modeling clay. Being Sunday, you had to build a recognizable Bible story with them. For the older ones, there was missionary books, and how my mother, in her busy life, managed to write so many missionaries and persuade them to produce letters and postcards and photographs, etc., is still a mystery to me, but there was always a pile of material for our fascinating scrapbooks, and I still have mine with pictures carefully pasted and painstaking accounts of our tiny collections. The evenings were spent round the old piano, singing those old hymns, then beloved of little children, with their bright imaginary of blue skies and shepherds and lambs, or marching round the table with a percussion band to the strain of Onward Christian Soldiers, or some such military theme. In winter we gathered around the fire, and my mother would read us a Sunday book. Sunday books in those days were not very cheerful. They were nearly all about poor little orphans who lived in slums and died making beautiful speeches pages long. My mother would cry and we would shout with laughter at her. We were not nice children. We would all enjoy ourselves immensely. It was during one of those fireside readings that I had my first distinct experience of God. The story was Pearl's Secret, and as usual, it was about a little girl who died. It was a true story set in China, and the child had copied out the first verse of Isaiah 43 just before she was taken ill, and that night we learned the verse by heart. Thus saith the Lord, fear not, I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name, and thou art mine. I, probably aged about 6, did not understand the word redeemed, but the last 2 phrases seemed clear and simple. I went straight up to my room where I slept, and I knelt down. My name is Patricia, I said, and if you're really calling me, I want to come and be yours. I cannot remember any clear result except that next morning I ran out into the garden and looked up into the hollyhocks, which were much taller than I was, and thought how exquisitely beautiful they were. This is my first memory of consciously noticing beauty, and surely this was to have been expected. I had in a new way become God's child. I had been accepted into the realm of beauty. When a little child turns to God in sincerity, how much does he really understand? Probably not very much, just in a sense of security and belonging, probably not much more than those children understood who ran to Christ on earth and felt his hand laid on their heads. He may even forget the experience, and in later years imagine that nothing happened. The importance of it lies in the strength and the faithfulness of the love that received him, and that it will be forever drawing him back to the first resting place. My mother believed strongly in the early conversions, and like those mothers of long ago, she brought her little children to Jesus. In a busy home and far away from strange lands, my parents prayed for us, and one of my very earliest memories is of waking up late one night and seeing my mother kneeling in the dark beside Hazel's bed. I watched, surprised, for she had already prayed for us before tucking us up. But after a time she rose and knelt again by Farnham's bed. It seemed a long time before she came and knelt by me, and I pretended to be asleep because I wanted to see this through. Surely she would not bother about the baby. He was far too little to understand. Yet sure enough, she moved on to the cot. I never forgot that night, but I cannot explain why. Perhaps I drifted off to sleep with an added sense of security. Perhaps I glimpsed dimly that night the truth of the words that I discovered years later, that the angels of God's little ones do always behold the face of the Father in heaven. And tomorrow we'll be reading chapter 3, Swiss Interlude. I love you and I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.